I remember that morning with a peculiar tenderness, though tenderness was never something Oxford encouraged in men of my profession. The bells had begun early, long before the mist had lifted from the cobbles of St. Giles, and their chime was less a summons than a reminder that time, relentless and uncaring, moves, whether we notice it or not. I paused, as I so often did, at the small cafe near the Ashmolean where the tea was tolerable and the papers arrived late. A crossword spread across the back page, clues half solved by some earlier visitor, and I could not resist the temptation of filling in the blanks. One clue caught my eye, 6 letters, one who remains behind, forgotten. I tried relict, tried lagger, until only shadow seemed to fit. And in that small act of deduction I felt the weight of the case that was about to unfold, though at the time I knew nothing of it. I had been restless the night before, pacing between my shelves of classical texts and the window that looked across to the spire of St. Mary's. The city slept under drizzle, the stones gleaming like damp parchment, and I thought again of how Oxford is both guardian of knowledge and keeper of secrets. No street is innocent, no archway unobserved. Perhaps that is why I felt uneasy even before the telephone rang. The voice was hesitant, too formal for the hour, belonging to a porter at one of the lesser colleges. He reported almost apologetically that a fellow had been found in his rooms, unresponsive, the circumstances irregular. He did not say dead. They never do. They say unresponsive, not quite well, in need of assistance. Words chosen to delay the finality of things. I agreed to come, though I could hear the rain thickening against the glass, and would rather have remained with my crossword and silence. As I walked through the quadrangles later that morning, I thought how little changes here, the lawns trimmed with near religious fervour, the carved stone worn down by centuries of indifferent footsteps, the faint echo of bell metal still drifting in the air. A college at rest looks deceptively peaceful, as if mischief and death could never breach its ancient walls. But they do, time and again, and perhaps that is why the dons look at me with something between disdain and reluctant gratitude. They know I see through their veils. The room was modest, almost ascetic. Books lined the walls in no particular order. A chessboard with one game half played rested by the window, and on the desk a letter had been abandoned, the ink still not wholly dry. The man lay upon the bed, his spectacles tilted against his cheek, as though sleep had simply turned traitor. Yet there was a stiffness to the air that spoke not of sleep, but of conclusion. I bent closer. A faint smell of almonds lingered. Cyanide, perhaps, though I would not rush to decide. A glass stood on the bedside table, water half drunk, the rim smudged by lips that had known no company in hours. Strange, I thought, that the chessboard bore no white queen. The pieces are otherwise complete, yet that absence drew me more than the body itself. I asked the porter if he played. He shook his head, eyes averted. I asked who last visited. He muttered about a colleague, a lecture, something inconsequential. I let the words wash over me, knowing that the truth was elsewhere, in the silence, in the missing queen, in the crossword clue that had whispered shadow earlier that morning. Walking back across the quadrangle, I heard the bells once more, lighter now, as if mocking the scene I had just left. Students hurried past, indifferent to tragedy, and I envied them that carelessness. I lit a cigarette, though the rain dampened it almost at once, and considered how Oxford wears its tragedies like moss upon its stone, quiet, inevitable, unremarked. This was not the first such death, nor would it be the last. Yet already I felt the peculiar stirring that always accompanied the first steps of an investigation, that behind the routine of tea and lectures, of footnotes and translations, something darker had taken root, and it was my duty, though never my choice, to name it. There is something about cloisters that never fails to remind me of time's indifference. Perhaps it is the echo of footsteps made indistinguishable across centuries, or the cool stone which has no interest in who leans against it. St. Edmund's was quieter than most, its arches carrying only the sound of water dripping from gutters after the rain. I had walked there many times, though never with quite the sense of unease that accompanied me that morning. The porter had led me through a narrow side gate, muttering about scholars asleep and how unpleasant it was to rouse them with ill news. He left me at the cloisters, as though reluctant to trespass further into whatever sorrow awaited inside. I was alone, save for the faint smell of damp mortar and the faint trace of candle wax clinging to the air, a remnant of some half-forgotten service. Oxford has a way of keeping its griefs tucked neatly away, behind oaken doors and between Latin inscriptions. I stopped by a bench, cold with moisture, and studied the courtyard grass. It was patchy, uneven, marked by darker squares where furniture had once been dragged across for summer gatherings. I thought of the chessboard again, its missing queen. A small thing easily dismissed, but it pressed upon me with the peculiar persistence of detail that refuses to be silenced. In some cases, the absence of what ought to be present weighs more than any discovery. A fellow appeared from one of the staircases, his robe hastily arranged, his eyes narrowed as if the dawn light itself offended him. He asked if it was true, the rumour of a death in college. I told him little, for I had learned long ago that too much honesty at the outset ruins one's chance of hearing the truth unguarded. He sighed, an academic sigh, weary not from emotion, but from the disruption of routine. He said the man had dined alone last night, lingered in the hall when the rest had gone. He had a habit of solitude, a fondness for puzzles and languages. I asked which languages. He paused as though the question were impertinent, then muttered, Greek, a little German, and always Latin. Always Latin, as though that was some private key. I moved on through the cloisters, touching the cool rail of the balustrade. My own education returned to me in fragments. Horace, Catullus, passages of Tacitus half-remembered, their cadences still echoing in the mind like faint bells. A college is never more alive than when it pretends to be silent. From the windows above came faint stirrings, the clearing of a throat, the rustle of paper, the sound of water in a jug. Each sound carried meaning, though I could not yet place it. By the chapel door I found a small notice board, a list of upcoming lectures, some already crossed through. The deceased had been scheduled to give one of the medieval manuscripts cancelled now, a thin line drawn through his name. Someone had taken the trouble to strike it neatly, almost reverently. I lingered over the handwriting, small, precise, feminine perhaps. I thought of the chessboard again, its absent queen, and wondered whose hand had excised his name so carefully. I stepped into the chapel. Empty pews, the scent of polish and old books. The lectern bore a Bible, open to the Psalms. The verse happened to read, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help." A coincidence, of course, but coincidences in Oxford carry a weight heavier than elsewhere. I closed the book gently, unwilling to disturb the balance of chance and meaning. Back in the cloister, a young student waited, awkward, shifting weight from foot to foot. He said he had known the dead man slightly and had borrowed notes from him for an exam. He asked if it had been an accident. I told him it was too soon to say. He nodded, though his eyes betrayed something more relief, perhaps, or guilt disguised as indifference. When he turned away, I noticed ink on his cuff, smudged as though in haste. Small details linger when they should not. I left the cloisters with the bells striking again. slower now, their tones spreading across the roops like a weary breath. The porter met me at the gate, eager for reassurance. I gave him none. I told him simply to keep his eyes open. He looked puzzled, but agreed. As I walked back through the streets, I thought of the crossword clue again. Shadow, one who remains behind, forgotten. In those cloisters, beneath their symmetry and order, I had sensed only shadows of words unsaid, of glances averted, of names crossed out with too much care. Oxford, as ever, whispered its secrets not through declarations, but through the silences between them. The phrase circle of suspects has always struck me as misleading. It suggests symmetry, fairness, a neat alignment of possibilities from which the truth can be plucked, like the center of a daisy. In truth, such circles are irregular things, weighted with prejudice and silence, some faces brighter than others, some names whispered with more relish than care. At St. Edmund's, the circle was already forming before I asked a single question. The common room smelled of tobacco and stale port, as it always did, in the early hours when the fire had long since died and the curtains hung limp with damp. A few fellows had gathered, drawn less by grief than by curiosity. They spoke of the dead man with the peculiar mixture of formality and carelessness that dons reserve for colleagues familiar yet never intimate. One said he had been difficult, another said brilliant, a third muttered something about loneliness. None admitted affection. I sat quietly, listening. Their words were rehearsed, even those spoken in haste. It was clear they had been preparing themselves for the questions they assumed I would ask. I noted who spoke too quickly, who hesitated, who turned a glass between restless fingers. One man, thin and impatient, referred to the death as unfortunate, an accident perhaps, though no one had suggested an accident until he raised it. Another, a woman whose eyes rarely met mine, remarked on the man's recent despondency, as though the possibility of suicide might free the college of any shame. It is in such conversations that one learns less from what is said than from the choreography of speech. Who interrupts, who waits, who looks at the floor when another is mentioned. I thought again of the missing queen on the chessboard, and as the voices circled round me, I began to wonder who here considered themselves the king, and who merely a pawn. A younger lecturer, his voice lighter than the rest, recalled that the deceased had spent hours in the library that week. He said he had seen him bent over a manuscript, something in Latin, though he confessed he could not distinguish Cicero from Augustine. The remark drew a ripple of laughter, nervous, forced. I did not laugh. I asked whether anyone knew what manuscript it had been. No one answered, though the woman with the downcast eyes shifted slightly in her seat, a movement so small it could have been ignored. But I did not ignore it. Subtle shifts are often the only truths one is given. After the common room emptied, I lingered. The fire grate was cold, yet I imagined the warmth that must have filled the room the night before. Conversations, arguments, confessions, perhaps. Death rarely arrives from nowhere. It is usually preceded by whispers, omissions, and small betrayals hidden in laughter. I looked at the mantelpiece, where a row of silver cups gleamed dully. One bore an inscription from the 1930s chess champion, St. Edmund's College. I traced the letters with my finger and thought again of the vanished queen. Later, in the corridor, I encountered the student with ink on his cuff. He was alone, clutching a notebook. He asked whether the police had found a letter, something to explain matters. His voice was steady, too steady for someone of his age. I asked why he expected a letter. He said simply that men like him always leave one. Then he hurried away, the notebook pressed too tightly against his chest. I wrote nothing down, but the exchange etched itself into my memory. Expectation often betrays knowledge. The rain had begun again by the time I stepped outside. The cloisters shone, slick and dark, each stone reflecting the faint glow of the lamps. The circle of suspects felt less a gathering of people than a shadow cast by the college itself. Each face I had seen, each gesture, belonged to a pattern I had not yet deciphered. And as I walked away, the bells struck once more, not in harmony, but in a staggered dissonance, like voices unwilling to agree on the same truth. There are rooms in Oxford one never enters without hesitation. Locked rooms, in both the literal and the figurative sense. They are repositories not only of manuscripts and relics, but of recollections no one willingly revisits. I have often thought that memory itself is a kind of college cloister where we linger, staircases we ascend too quickly, and rooms we keep closed because we know too well what lies behind them. That morning, it was such a door I was handed a key to, though the porter called it nothing more than the deceased's set of rooms. The stair creaked beneath me as I ascended. The stone was worn into shallow cups by centuries of boots, each step a palimpsest of the generations who had gone before. A faint draught tugged at my sleeve, carrying the smell of extinguished candles and something sharper, less wholesome ink, perhaps, or the bitter tang of chemical residue. The door opened reluctantly, hinges whispering in protest, as though they too resented my intrusion. The room within was neat, too neat, a scholar's den arranged with the care of a man who trusted order more than people. The bookshelves were stacked by size rather than subject, an affectation that drew the eye but obscured the mind. A half-burned candle stood on the desk beside a sheaf of notes, Latin phrases scrawled in a hand, growing increasingly frantic across the page. I traced the lines with my finger. Some were translations, others mere fragments, but one phrase had been underlined twice: Regina abscondita, the hidden queen. Again, that silent reminder of the chessboard missing its monarch. I sat in the armchair, uncomfortable, as if borrowing another man's solitude. On the mantel above the fireplace lay a collection of postcards, yellowing at the corners, views of Rome, of Vienna, of Heidelberg. None bore messages. It struck me as odd that a man so punctilious in study should keep blank postcards, as though he preferred the image without the voice, the facade without the confession. I pocketed one absent-mindedly, not as evidence perhaps, but as a clue to temperament. A detective must sometimes collect silence as carefully as a statement. On the bed, scarcely disturbed, a folded gown lay as though awaiting a lecture that would never be given. I touched the sleeve and found a pin tucked into the fold, a small brass badge bearing the emblem of another college altogether. What business had he in their halls? It was not unusual, yet it was not expected either, and it reminded me of a crossword clue I had wrestled with the previous evening. 5 letters, uninvited guest. My first thought had been crash, but only mouse fit the crossing letters. A creature that enters quietly, feeds unseen, and leaves the faintest of traces. I looked at that little pin and thought of mice. I examined the desk more closely. In one drawer, carefully locked, I found a pile of letters, none recent, each folded with precision. Their contents were unremarkable academic disputes, invitations to lecture, acknowledgments from journals. Yet one envelope bore no address, only a word written across its face in an angular script: remember. It was empty. That, I thought, was perhaps the most eloquent letter of all. When I left the room, I closed the door softly, aware that I was shutting away more than paper and furniture. A student loitered at the far end of the corridor. He pretended to be searching his pocket for a key, though his eyes darted towards me, then away. I asked if he had known the fellow. He shrugged, said little, but his shoes were damp as though he had walked recently through the rain, though no rain had fallen since dawn. A detail, nothing more, yet it clung to me. Descending the staircase, I thought of my own rooms, the clutter of papers, the empty whiskey glass left by the bed. Locked rooms of memory are not confined to the dead. We each carry them filled with what we have lost or chosen not to recall. And in Oxford, a city of doors and keys, one learns that the most dangerous rooms are not those closed to us, but those we open too readily, only to find that nothing within is quite as it seemed. I have sometimes wondered whether all investigations are in truth only diversions from ourselves, and whether the puzzles we pursue in others are no more than a reflection of our own unfinished crosswords. That evening, I found myself in the bar of a small inn off the high street, a glass of indifferent claret before me, the paper folded neatly beside it. Outside, the rain slanted against the window panes, blurring the lamps into wavering stars. Inside, the hum of conversation softened into background music, the scrape of a chair, the muted laughter of two women at the far table, the clink of a coin upon wood. I took up the crossword again, more out of habit than enthusiasm. 12 across a game where truth is sacrificed to 7 letters. I tried chess, too short. Drafts, no good. Finally, riddles fit the crossings. I underlined it softly, as though it had chosen itself. Sacrifices, I thought, are rarely confined to games. The woman noticed me, though I kept my eyes upon the paper. They were not students too carefully dressed, too aware of the effect of their presence. One of them leaned towards me, asked if the crossword was difficult tonight. I muttered something about evasive setters and trustworthy definitions. She laughed, not at the words, but at the tone, and said the man who had died had sometimes sat in that very corner, nursing the same glass of claret. She said he was courteous, distracted, fond of Latin phrases he assumed others could not understand. Her companion added that he once spoke of a queen lost in a game, but whether it was chess or something else, she could not be sure. It struck me then, the odd persistence of that missing queen, as if Oxford itself conspired to keep repeating the refrain until I surrendered to its meaning. I asked when they had last seen him. One replied, perhaps a week ago. The other shook her head, said longer. Their disagreement was unstudied, genuine, and I believed both. Memory has a way of arranging itself to suit the one who recalls. Still, I wrote the date down in my mind alongside the crossword clue. The barman approached, refilled my glass without asking. He murmured that the fellow often drank here alone, rarely more than 2 glasses, never 3. An ascetic man, he said, though not without charm. I asked if anyone joined him. The barman hesitated, then mentioned a younger student, perhaps the same one with ink upon his cuff, who came sometimes in the evenings, restless, asking questions that seemed more personal than academic. The fellow, he said, always answered with patience, but with that kind of patience that is more resignation than generosity. The women departed soon after, leaving a trace of perfume in the damp air, something floral, oddly out of place amid the claret and tobacco. I watched them go and wondered if they would speak of me tomorrow, as they had spoken of him tonight, reducing both our lives to anecdotes exchanged over wine. In Oxford, reputations rarely outlive rumours, and rumours never truly die. I lingered a little longer, filling in the final clues, careless with the pencil. One remained a stubborn, faithless companion's 6 letters. I stared at it until the letters resolved themselves into Judas. The setter had chosen well. Faithless companions abound both in Scripture and in common rooms, and perhaps, I thought, in this case too. When I finally left the inn, the rain had eased into a fine mist. The streets gleamed like varnished wood, each step echoing faintly against the stone. I thought again of the women, the students, the careful silences of the dons. The circle was widening, though never quite enough to reveal its centre. And as I folded the crossword into my pocket, half-solved, imperfect, I could not help but wonder whether all mysteries end that way unfinished, yet somehow complete in their incompleteness. It is a strange truth of my trade that one must often walk willingly into error, as though only by losing one's way can the shape of the path reveal itself. The first false trail is never wasted. It leaves its residue upon the mind, reminding you how little is certain, how easily reason can be seduced by appearances. At St. Edmund's, I followed such a trail with more eagerness than I care to admit. The clue came in the form of a letter handed to me by the porter with the sort of cautious pride that small men display when they believe themselves indispensable. He said it had been delivered late the previous night, unsigned, addressed simply to the investigator. The envelope was plain, the paper ordinary, but the words within suggested otherwise. It warned of secret meetings in another college, a hidden correspondence, the kind of intrigue that appeals to one's darker suspicions. I ought to have dismissed it at once as the work of some student eager for drama, but I confess it drew me in. That afternoon I walked across the city, the rain a persistent companion. The Bodleian's dome glistened like tarnished silver, the Radcliffe camera loomed in its usual watchful silence, and the pavements shone with the footprints of scholars and strangers alike. I followed the directions in the letter, narrow lanes that curved toward a lesser-known college where the gates stood ajar. Inside, the quadrangle was deserted, the windows blank. I felt the peculiar thrill of trespass, though I had been invited by ink rather than voice. In the library I found nothing unusual. Rows of books, dust upon the ledges, the stale perfume of bindings left unopened too long. Yet one volume lay slightly askew, its spine crooked, as if replaced in haste. I pulled it free from a collection of Horace, margins annotated in a cramped, hurried hand. The notes spoke of longing, betrayal, loss. I traced one passage, underlined twice, and thought it might reveal something. But when I questioned the librarian, she shook her head. The book had not been borrowed in months. A ghost had left those marks, not a living suspect. Later, in the refectory, I encountered a man who claimed to have seen the deceased in those very cloisters, in the company of a young woman whose name he did not know. He said they spoke in low voices, heads bent close like conspirators. His story was too precise, too polished, and I should have doubted it sooner. But I wrote it down, allowed it to colour my thinking, to lead me toward a conclusion that seemed plausible, almost elegant, a forbidden liaison, a threat of exposure, a desperate silence imposed by poison. It fit the pieces I had like an answer to a crossword clue that satisfies only until another crossing proves it false. It was the crossword, in fact, that saved me from further folly. That evening, in my room, I studied the day's puzzle. 6 down deliberate deception, 5 letters. My first instinct was lie too short. Then I tried ruse, which fit neatly with the letters already in place. A deception, deliberate, polished. I remembered the man's certainty in the refectory. The casual precision with which he described the scene. It was too much. Real memory is ragged, blurred at the edges. He had been tidy, rehearsed, a ruse then, and I had nearly fallen for it. The following morning I returned to question him again, but he was gone. No one seemed to know where. Some said he was visiting family, others that he had gone abroad. The contradictions themselves revealed the truth. He was a shadow, perhaps not even a fellow of the college, but an intruder of another kind, weaving his own story into mine. A false trail, carefully laid, meant to occupy my time, while the real business unfolded elsewhere. As I walked back through the city, past the Sheldonian and the worn stones of Broad Street, I felt the weight of failure, though I told myself it was only the first of many such diversions. Every investigation requires them to be the scaffolding upon which the real structure is built. Still, I could not shake the faint bitterness of having been played, of seeing too late what I should have noticed at once. The bells tolled again as I reached St. Edmund's, their tones neither mournful nor celebratory, but indifferent. And in that sound I heard my own chiding that even the cleverest of men can be deceived, that even in Oxford, perhaps especially here, the truth prefers to hide behind locked doors, sending us down corridors where every shadow might be mistaken for substance. The chapel at St. Edmund's was never intended for grandeur. Its proportions were modest, its windows unremarkable, its pews scarred by decades of inattentive fingernails. Yet in the half-light of evening, it possessed an austerity that could unsettle even the most resolute of minds. I entered when the last of the students had drifted away, their chatter still clinging faintly to the stone before dissolving into silence. The air was cool, with that peculiar mingling of wax, dust, and damp wool that lingers long after the congregation has gone. I walked slowly down the aisle, listening to the hollow tap of my steps. The echo followed me like a hesitant companion. Above, the roof beams were dark with centuries of smoke, and somewhere a draught toyed with the flame of a solitary candle left burning near the altar. I sat, not to pray, but to think. There is a difference. The lectern still bore its open Bible, the same passage I had noticed earlier in the week. I touched the page lightly, as though it might bruise, and read again the warning not to put one's trust in princes. I wondered if the deceased had read these very words before his end, whether they had whispered to him in the quiet hours. Faith, after all, is another kind of puzzlesome belief others translate and most pretend. I belonged to the last category. From the shadows at the back, a figure emerged. A fellow of the college, older, stooped, his cassock rustling faintly as he moved. He said he had known the dead man, not well, but well enough to sense his troubles. He spoke of arguments over manuscripts, of whispered disputes about provenance and ownership. He lowered his voice when he told me the man had been accused of nothing formal, only suspicions of passing work to another institution in exchange for favours. His eyes did not quite meet mine. Guilt or the weight of discretion? In Oxford, the two are often indistinguishable. When he left, his footsteps faded too quickly, as if the chapel itself absorbed the sound. I sat longer, considering his words, and found myself staring at the brass memorial plaques along the walls. Names etched into permanence, their virtues summarized in Latin brevity. One plaque bore the motto, Fiat Lux, let there be light. Yet in that place, light seemed the one element most absent. My attention was caught by something less solemn, a hymn book left askew on a pew near the front. I opened it idly, more out of habit than interest. In the margin of one page, faint pencil marks formed not words but a sequence of numbers 3, 7, 11. I puzzled over them, until the thought occurred that they matched hymn numbers listed at the back. Turning to them, I found each hymn began with the same word, shadow, the very word that had stalked me since that first crossword clue. I closed the book, slowly, as though it had spoken to directly. The organ pipes above me loomed in silence, but I fancied I could hear a low note vibrating still, some remnant of an earlier practice. It reminded me that memory, like sound, never quite disappears. It only becomes inaudible. And I wondered what memories the chapel carried, what whispers it had absorbed across centuries of whispered vows and confessions. Perhaps the dead man had sought solace here, or perhaps he had hidden something, trusting the sanctity of the place to keep it safe. When at last I stepped outside, night had fallen. The quad lay under a sheen of moonlight, the grass pale as parchment, The air smelt of rain, though none had yet come, and the silence was broken only by the distant clatter of a bicycle on cobblestones. I paused beneath the chapel door, reluctant to leave. The echoes of that place clung to the old fellow's hesitant disclosures, the hymn book's silent code, the candle guttering as though choked by its own smoke. And I realized with a faint unease that Oxford's chapels are not places of peace. They are vaults, storing the unspoken, amplifying it, returning it to those who dare to listen. That evening I listened, though I could not yet decipher the message. Perhaps I thought some truths are like echoes, audible only when the speaker has long gone, and the stones themselves have taken up the telling. Desire in Oxford rarely announces itself in bold colours. It prefers the shadows of cloisters, the discreet exchange of glances in lecture halls, the half-written letters left to languish in locked drawers. Deception, meanwhile, flourishes in precisely the same places. One never truly knows which is which until too late. That evening, I was reminded of how easily they overlap, and how willingly we allow ourselves to be led astray by either. I found myself once more in the common room, where the fire had been coaxed into a reluctant glow. A handful of fellows gathered there, their conversation muted, broken by pauses that seemed more significant than the words themselves. A glass of sherry passed from hand to hand, though no one seemed much inclined to drink. Their eyes flickered toward me, then away again, as if rehearsing the art of appearing both open and guarded. One of them, a younger don with prematurely greying hair, ventured to remark that the deceased had been foolish in his attachments. He used the word imprudent, though his tone implied something more carnal. I asked what he meant. He shrugged, shifted uneasily, then said that affection is a dangerous indulgence in academic life, particularly when directed where it ought not be. His colleagues frowned, but did not contradict him. Their silence was an answer of its own. Later, in the corridor, I encountered the woman whose eyes had so often dropped to the floor when others spoke. She lingered by the notice board, her hand tracing absent circles across the wood, as though undecided whether to leave or remain. I asked if she had been close to him. Her lips pressed together, and for a moment I thought she would walk away. Instead, she said softly that he had been kind, more attentive than most, and that kindness of that sort can be misinterpreted or exploited. She did not elaborate, nor did I press. The heart is always more complex than evidence permits. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword again. 10 down, what blinds the wise and betrays the weak Seven letters. The letters I had already filled allowed only desire. I wrote it slowly, reluctant to give it form. It seemed too neat, too opposite. Yet the setter had placed it there, and I could not escape its relevance. Desire blinds, and in its blindness it prepares the stage for deception. The following morning I walked the damp quadrangle and found the student once more, the one whose ink-stained cuff betrayed too hasty a hand. He greeted me with a forced brightness, the kind of tone students adopt when concealing unease. I asked casually whether he had often sought the fellow's advice. He admitted he had, but added that the man demanded nothing in return except time. Too much time, perhaps, he said, as though time itself could be bartered like a coin. I asked what they spoke of. He wrote vague manuscripts, translations, and fragments of poetry. Yet his eyes, darting away, hinted at other conversations he did not wish to name. In Oxford, rumour travels faster than fact. By evening I had heard whispers of meetings in borrowed rooms, of letters exchanged under false pretences, of allegiances that crossed the porous boundaries between colleges. Whether these whispers contained truth or merely the echo of envy, I could not yet say, but the picture forming was less of academic rivalry than of human entanglement, desire shaded with secrecy, secrecy hardening into deception. It is easy in such cases to leap towards scandal, but scandal is too simple. The dead man's rooms, his chessboard missing its queen, the postcard without words, the hymn book with its shadowed clues, suggested a subtler, more ambiguous web. If desire had played its part, it was not the lusty impulse the dons hinted at, nor the sentimental kindness the woman described. It was something quieter, lonelier. A longing not just for company but for recognition, for significance in a world that often overlooks even its brightest minds. And deception, perhaps it was less an act committed against him than one he committed against himself, believing what he wished to be true. I left the college that night with a heaviness I could not name. The rain had begun again, soft at first, then more insistent, drumming against my coat as I crossed the empty streets. Desire and deception are two halves of the same wordless confession. Both had left their imprint on this case, though whether they belonged to the dead man or to those who survived him remained unresolved. And perhaps that was the point. In Oxford, truth is rarely a single flame. It is more often a wavering light, shifting as you move, revealing just enough to keep you searching. It is a peculiar cruelty of the mind that it prefers the comfort of false answers to the discomfort of uncertainty. I had convinced myself, for a brief time, that the shape of the puzzle was clear, that the pieces were falling into their rightful places. Yet clarity is so often no more than the thin glaze of wishful thinking. What I thought I had grasped slipped quickly through my fingers, leaving only the bitter taste of error. The theory was simple enough. A liaison gone sour, secrets exchanged for favors, the slow corrosion of reputation leading to despair. It had the neatness of a crossword completed too quickly, each word fitting well enough, but the whole betraying a faint unease, a quiet wrongness. I allowed myself to believe it, if only because I longed for the relief of closure. But Oxford has a way of mocking premature certainty. I spent the afternoon in the college archives, where the air was heavy with dust and silence. The shelves rose high, packed with manuscripts too delicate to touch, each labelled with dates that spanned centuries. The archivist, a man of fastidious manners, handed me a set of papers once belonging to the deceased. I searched for proof of impropriety, some trace of betrayal. What I found instead were pages of translation exercises, drafts of lectures, marginal notes on Latin verse. Nothing illicit, nothing damning. The quiet labour of a scholar, not the machinations of a conspirator. As I turned one of the pages, a small scrap of paper slipped free. On it was a single word, written in hurried pencil light. It struck me as odd. A solitary word, not part of a sentence, not linked to any translation. I placed it carefully aside, though at the time I could not see its relevance. A clue, perhaps, or a fragment of some private code. But in that moment it felt more like a reproach, a reminder that what I sought in darkness might only be revealed by another kind of illumination. That evening I sought counsel from the woman whose eyes had so often betrayed knowledge she would not speak. Over coffee in a quiet corner of the dining hall, she told me the dead man had been gentle, too gentle, incapable of the sort of duplicity I had begun to suspect. She said he lived for his books and for small kindnesses, the lending of notes, the guiding of lost students through labyrinthine texts. If he harboured desires, they were unspoken, never flaunted. She spoke with conviction, though not without hesitation, as if she wished her words to absolve not only him, but herself as well. I walked back across the quad afterwards, the rain falling in thin, slanting sheets, and considered the possibility that she was right. The supposed affair, the whispered betrayals, these were stories others had woven, convenient explanations for a death that unsettled them. Perhaps I had been too eager to accept them, too ready to see shadows where there was only loneliness. But Then near the chapel, I passed the student again to the boy with the ink-stained cuff. He stood beneath an archway, half hidden, speaking quietly with another figure whose face I could not make out. As I approached, the student stepped back, startled, and muttered a hurried excuse before disappearing into the cloisters. The other figure was gone before I could speak. Only the echo of their conversation lingered, carried faintly by the damp air. I caught a single word, Queen. That word again, echoing from chessboard to hymn book, from conversation to corridor. The missing queen, never present, always invoked. And so the second solution I had constructed, the tidy tale of desire turned rancid, collapsed under its own weight. The truth was not so simple, nor so satisfying. The shadows remained unbroken, their shapes shifting as I tried to give them form. I thought of the crossword clue that had haunted me days before shadow, one who remains behind, forgotten. I began to realize that I, too, was being led by shadows, mistaking their outline for substance. That night in my room, I poured a whiskey and stared at the crossword left unfinished on the table. 7 down remained unsolved. Answer that proves false 9 letters. I tried deception, too short. I tried misbelief, awkward. At last, I wrote down solution and immediately crossed it through. A solution can be as false as any lie, and sometimes the worst deception is the one we weave ourselves. The Bodleian at dusk is never empty, though it often gives the impression of being deserted. The silence is deceptive. Pages turn, pens scratch, coughs are suppressed into sleeves, but the weight of centuries muffles every sound into something almost spectral. I have always felt that a library is less a place of study than a cemetery, each book a headstone marking the resting place of another man's thoughts. That evening, I went there not to read, but to search among the gravestones for one name in particular. The deceased had spent much of his final weeks in the library, or so I had been told. He had reserved a seat in the upper reading room, a desk by the tall windows where the light lingers longest. I stood there for a while, imagining him hunched over manuscripts, the faint rasp of his pen blending with the scratchings of countless others. The seat bore no trace of him now, save for a faint indentation in the wood where elbows might have pressed night after night. A small thing, yet it felt more personal than any photograph could have been. I asked the assistant on duty if anything had been left behind, forgotten. She produced a small pile of papers, loose notes, that had been gathered after his death, nothing remarkable, translations, jottings, a few fragments of poetry, but one sheet carried a heading that caught my eye: Regina abscondita, the hidden queen, the phrase that had haunted me since the chessboard. Beneath it, a series of lines copied from a medieval text, each followed by marginalia in a cramped hand. The notes seemed incomplete, interrupted, as though the writer had been distracted or unwilling to finish the thought. I took the sheet to the window and studied it more closely. The Latin was familiar, though the translation he attempted was oddly hesitant. A single word stood out: lumen, light. It recalled the scrap of paper I had found earlier with that same word scrawled upon it. 2 appearances of the same idea in different contexts by the same hand. Not a coincidence, I thought. More likely a signpost, though I had not yet guessed the direction. The clue came not from the text itself, but from the book in which it had been found. I asked the assistant to fetch it, and after some searching she produced a heavy volume bound in cracked leather, its spine worn smooth by generations. I opened it carefully, the pages brittle under my touch. On the title page, beneath the printed dedication, someone had written in faded ink a line of Latin that was not part of the text. It was no more than 5 words, but they altered everything lux in tenebris later. The light hides in darkness. I traced the inscription with my finger. The hand was not modern, perhaps the 19th century, perhaps older, but the deceased had underlined it in pencil, faintly but deliberately. That was enough. He had seen meaning there, something worth marking, though whether for scholarship or for himself I could not yet tell. As I stood with the book open, I became aware of another presence in the reading room. The student again, the boy with ink-stained cuffs pretending to consult a reference volume a few desks away. He glanced up, caught my eye, and quickly looked back down. It was not the act of an innocent scholar, but of someone rehearsing concealment. I wondered how many evenings he had sat there, not to study but to watch, waiting for the dead man to slip, to reveal something. Desire, deception, and now light. The elements aligned themselves, though still without form. When I returned the book to the desk, I asked the assistant whether the inscription had ever been catalogued. She shook her head. It was, she said, of no particular note. I smiled faintly at that. In Oxford, what is not catalogued often proves most significant. The institution records only what it values. The rest is left to shadows, to chance, to the investigator who lingers too long among dust and silence. I left the library as the doors closed for the night. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the stones of Radcliffe Square glistened with a damp sheen. The lamps cast their halos on the wet pavement, small islands of brightness in the gloom. I thought again of the inscription, the light hides in darkness. Perhaps that was what the dead man had sought, or what he had feared. Perhaps it was what I was seeking too, though I would not have admitted it then. The bells began their measured tolling across the city, solemn, patient, indifferent. And as I walked away, I carried with me the sense that I had touched upon something essential, though its meaning still lay hidden like the faint inscription in the book, waiting for someone foolish enough or desperate enough to read it. There are confessions spoken aloud, and there are those that hover, unvoiced, around the edges of conversational confessions one can hear only by listening for what is absent. In Oxford, the spires themselves seem to carry these silences, their shadows stretched across the cobbles like long, thin secrets. I remember that night when one such confession brushed close enough to touch, though even then it refused to settle into clarity. The city was shrouded in mist, the lamps on Broad Street blurred into pale orbs, as if someone had smudged them with a wet thumb. I walked slowly, coat damp, shoes tapping against the stone with a rhythm that echoed more loudly than I intended. My steps led me to the base of a chapel spire, where the air smelled faintly of incense mixed with rain. There, waiting in the half-light, was the woman whose eyes had so often betrayed her reluctance to speak. She told me he had cared for her, not romantically, though she paused long enough between words to let me wonder, but in a way that unsettled her. A devotion disguised as mentorship, or perhaps the other way round. He wrote to her sometimes in Latin phrases she half understood. He once pressed a postcard into her hand, blank on its reverse, as though expecting her to know what message it contained without words. She said she had never replied, and she looked away as she said it, towards the spire rising behind us, dissolving into mist. I asked whether she had seen him in his final days. She hesitated, then admitted she had met him here beneath this very spire not long before his death. He had spoken of shadows, of losing something precious. A queen, he had said. She thought he was talking about chess. I thought otherwise. Her voice lowered when she recalled his final words to her, not to forget the light, even when it hides itself. The phrase struck me with the weight of that library inscription, Luxa in tenebris latet. The light hides in darkness. Not coincidence, but a refrain. While she spoke, I watched her hands. They twisted a handkerchief slowly, methodically, as though rehearsing restraint. Yet at one moment, brief, almost imperceptible, let slip a gesture too precise to ignore. Her thumb brushed against her sleeve, where a small pin was fixed, a brass badge of another college. The same emblem I had found tucked into the dead man's gown. I said nothing, not then, but my mind tightened around the details. Shared loyalty or shared secret? The bells began to toll, their tones rolling across the rooftops with solemn persistence. She fell silent, listening, her face softened by the sound. I wondered whether she realized how much she had already confessed, though not in words. The absences, the omissions, the small betrayals of gesture, those were the truest confessions of all. I thanked her, and she looked at me with a mixture of relief and fear, as though uncertain whether my gratitude was a kindness or a sentence. Later, back in my room, I poured a whiskey and unfolded the crossword again. One clue had lingered unsolved 14 across, unspoken truth in letters. I stared at it for some time, trying falsehoods, then testament, until finally only confession would fit. I penciled it in, not with triumph, but with reluctance. A confession is never whole. It is only ever partial, shaded, compromised, and what I had been given beneath the spires was no exception. Outside my window the mist thickened, swallowing the spires until only their tips pierced the night sky like faint needles. The city seemed quieter than usual, as though holding its breath. Somewhere, I felt, the rest of the confession still waited, lodged not in words but in silence, in the shadows cast by rain-slicked stone. And I knew as I set down my glass that I would have to return to those shadows if I wished to hear what remained unsaid. Endings are seldom as final as we pretend. We attach words like coda or conclusion to them, as though naming could impose order upon absence, but absence has its own unruly logic. In Oxford, even silence lingers longer than it should, echoing between cloisters and spires like an unfinished phrase in a piece of music. The case at St. Edmund's ended, at least on paper, with signatures, reports, and the kind of bureaucratic finality that satisfies those who prefer answers to questions. Yet for me, it was never so simple. I remember sitting in the chapel one last time, long after the students had gone and the candles guttered in their sconces. The hymn book still lay open where I had left it days before, its penciled numbers faint but insistent. Shadow, shadow, shadow. I closed it gently, aware that some words refused to be dismissed. A draught moved across the stone floor, carrying with it the faintest scent of dust and wax, and I thought again of how death alters nothing of a place, only our perception of it. Outside, the city was restless with rain. I walked slowly through Radcliffe Square, past the darkened windows of the library where I had found the inscription. Lux in tenebris latet. The light hides in darkness. I wondered if the dead man had taken comfort in that phrase, or whether it had deepened his despair. Perhaps both. Oxford breeds such contradictions, one learns to live with them as one lives with damp walls or late posts. The woman with the lowered eyes and careful silences left the college soon after. No formal reason given, only an abrupt departure couched in administrative phrasing. I watched her from a distance as she crossed the quad for the last time, her figure small against the looming stone. I did not speak. She carried her own confessions, and whether they were sufficient to condemn or absolve her was not my decision to make. Some truths are best left unrecorded, for they damage more by exposure than concealment. The student with the ink-stained cuffs lingered longer. He approached me one afternoon, asked whether I believed the matter settled. I told him the truth, that it was settled enough for those who needed it to be. He frowned as though dissatisfied, then muttered something about queens, about games unfinished. His eyes held both fear and relief. I watched him walk away, his gait uncertain, and wondered what burden he carried that I hadn't yet seen. But the investigation had reached its allotted end, and further questions would have been unwelcome, perhaps even unwise. Back in my room, I unfolded the final crossword of the week. One clue stared up at me 16 across, what remains when the music stops 4 letters. I tried rest, then pause, before realizing the setter intended coda. A lonely coda, the small tailpiece that pretends to resolve, though it resolves nothing. I wrote it lightly, almost unwillingly, and closed the paper. The symmetry was too sharp, too rehearsed, like a gesture one repeats for comfort rather than necessity. I poured a whiskey and sat by the window, watching the rain trail down the glass in thin, irregular lines. The city lay quiet, its bells momentarily silent, its spires lost in mist. I thought of the dead man's chessboard, still missing its queen of the blank postcards, never written upon the inscription in the library, faint but deliberate. Each was a fragment, none a solution. And perhaps that was the only resolution to be had, not the neatness of completed puzzles, but the melancholy persistence of questions that outlive their answers. Later, as the night deepened, I found myself humming a phrase from a symphony I could not name. The notes rose, faltered, and fell away unresolved. I thought of him as the scholar, the man whose life had ended quietly in his room, and wondered whether he too had heard such music in his final moments. A lonely coda, neither triumph nor defeat, only the fading of sound into silence. That, I realized, is how most stories end, not with revelation but with echo. And Oxford, with its stones heavy with memory, knows how to keep an echo alive far longer than it ought to endure,